Because after all, Abraham had been approached by God to participate in this covenant relationship which had worldwide implications. Abraham was going to be the father of all nations. From Abraham, the chosen people would flow and have influence on the whole world. So Abraham had a hefty responsibility. It's not at all unreasonable to expect that God might want some assurance that Abraham is made of the right stuff. Now, God had already worked a pretty impressive miracle in Abraham's life. You'll remember that Sarah, Abraham's wife, was unable to conceive, and so she and Abraham did not have any children. And without children, it's hard for God to bless your offspring, isn't it? You've got to have something springing up to bless. Plus, they were both well past childbearing years. Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. Abraham, in fact, said to God, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? To which God responded, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. And the word Isaac means laughter. Did you know that? It means laughter. It's kind of like God has a sense of humor. And the scriptures tell us that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Sarah conceived and bore a son, and he was named Isaac, and everything seemed to be on track. And then out of nowhere, God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Again, what kind of a cruel test is that for God to ask of Abraham to pass? It almost sounds like the kind of thing one of those other false gods around there would demand. It almost sounds like it. That's a hint. Come back to that later. Now, as I said, we can't imagine doing what Abraham did. Can you imagine heading out to a place with your son and cutting the wood, packing it up so you'd have enough to burn your son's body up? We would never consider doing that. In fact, if God asked that of one of us, I'm pretty sure most of us in this room would just politely suggest that God take a long walk off a short pier, because we're not interested in, if that's what we have to do to prove our faith, we'd rather not have faith. But again, that's our 21st century view of religion and culture and ethics. And that stuff hadn't happened yet in that part of the world. And if you don't believe me, just read the chapters leading up to this passage, as Sarah and Abraham make their way to where God wants them to go. And you will see that the values and morals of that day were very different than they were today. And it also was a world, as you know, that believed in a multiplicity of gods. The idea of one true God was completely foreign to that part of the world. And the point I'm trying to make is, I don't want to belabor it, but I want to make the point that Abraham's actions would have seemed normal to the people of that day. They wouldn't have the reaction that we have at all to this story. And it also reflects the influence of the culture of that day, when parents would sacrifice their own children if they believed their God required it of them. I'm not saying it would have been easy, but they would have done it. And I can tell you they would have done it because they did it. And part of the ethical system that they were functioning under was it's better to sacrifice one for the good of many. So if you worship the god of rain, and you had a famine and it hadn't rained, a drought rather, and it hadn't rained, and some priest or whatever said, well, the god of the rain, he needs a sacrifice for the rain to go. You go, well, let's sacrifice one of our kids then. Better than that one kid gets killed and the whole village dies of starvation. So Abraham goes to the place of God's choosing, and once he gets there, he gets his son Isaac to carry the wood for his own funeral pyre. How twisted is that? And then then there's this poignant dialogue between Abraham and Isaac. Isaac looks up trustingly at his father and he goes, Dad, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham answered, oh, don't worry, God himself will provide the lamb. Now, I think it's really important for us to try to decide whether or not Abraham was lying to his son. Harold's on the wrong side of that equation. We love Harold anyway. Does Abraham really believe that God at the last minute is going to provide a sacrifice instead of Isaac? Or is he just saying this so Isaac keeps going where he's going? And I think we have to go back to verse 6 to ask the question, well, what about with his servants? Because before Abraham heads up with his son, he says to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We, meaning he and Isaac, will worship. And then we, meaning he and Isaac, will come back to you. That's what he says to the servants. So is he lying to the servants? Or does he really believe that God is going to do something? And I would suggest there's two things going on here. Obedience and trust. Abraham was obeying God's commands. He was following God's instructions. But at the same time, he was trusting that God would not go back on his word. That God would not destroy the very son God worked a miracle to bring into the world. So Abraham, you see, had come to trust God. He'd come to trust that God was true to his word because he'd seen that God had delivered on all the promises he'd made to Abraham thus far. So Abraham trusted that God would be faithful. Now, from God's perspective, there was never any intention to harm Isaac. When all was done, God spoke through the angel, do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. It's all good. And I can imagine Abraham thinking, well, that's just dandy. Could you have come up with a more gut-wrenching test for me to pass, perhaps? Why didn't you just ask me? And that might be our question as well. Why did God choose to put Abraham through that kind of grief? Through that scenario, through that horrendous drama? And I would suggest that there are at least three answers. And they're all kind of tied together. The first and foremost is that God made this choice to do this thing to separate himself from the other so-called gods of that time. The gods who were believed to require human sacrifice to be faithful. Those gods, in quotation marks, because we know they weren't real, used fear to intimidate their followers. And the God of Abraham and Isaac is saying, I am not going to rule with that kind of fear. I have shown you that I'm not the kind of God that demands human sacrifice. I value human life, and you need to know that. So God reveals that the God of Abraham is unique and benevolent and trustworthy. Second, this test did give Abraham the opportunity to reveal himself to be a faithful follower, one who trusts God and demonstrates a willingness to be obedient to God. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you must have thought of, I've certainly thought of this, was what would have happened if the voice of the angel hadn't been heard? Would Abraham have plunged the knife into his son's heart and killed him? Or would he have not done that and broken faith with God and said, okay, I don't trust you anymore? We will never know, will we? It's one of those wonderful things that just hangs on the edge. And the point is, we won't know what has been, but what we do know was what was. And what was that Abraham followed God's leading, showing himself to be faithful, and at the same time showed that he trusted that God would be faithful even in the trying circumstances. And the third thing that